So thank you for joining us today. My name is Ken Schmitt. I'm the CEO and founder of TurningPoint Executive Search and the Sales and Marketing Leadership Alliance. We're doing a lot of work these days with companies that are privately owned or that are owned by families and even by private equity firms as well. We're going to start this series out this year for 2021 to really be focusing on what the nuances are out there and what the unique environment and dynamic is like for folks that are coming on board. So I'm joined today by Edith Hamilton, who lives here in Southern California along with me. And we'll let her talk a little bit about what she does and her business as well. As you will see during the course of this conversation, there will be a lot of topics that we'll be touching on, and we're more than happy to have any kind of follow-up conversation or clarify any points also through future conversation discussion through social media or otherwise. So keep that in mind also. So Edith, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to spend this time with you. You are just an inspiration to me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to a lively conversation today about your practice and really how you support, how you help different executives really kind of easily, if you will, more smoothly transition into a new position and really make an impact early on. So do you want to talk a little bit about your firm and your business and what you do?
Exactly. Yes, I'm an executive coach and I work primarily with C-level executives, mostly CFOs, but also some chief operating officers and occasionally VPs of finance operations, and once in a while a director of finance or operations. And my focus with these individuals tends to be on helping them to either excel in the role that they're already in, because the PE firm has purchased the company and now it's a whole new ballgame, as you may know, as you well know, I should say. The level of expectation is suddenly much higher when you have a PE partner and you need to rethink how you do things in terms of your presentations and internal management reporting and so on. And so PE firms often bring me in order to partner with that CFO that they believe in and want to invest in. And then I also work with individuals who have been recruited either by a PE firm or some other organizations. Typically, these firms are between 75 million and 2 billion in size. And the individual says, I have this amazing opportunity. I want to make sure that I hit this out of the ballpark in the first 90 days and really start strong, leave an impression that has built a lot of credibility and has set the stage for me to have a lot of momentum going into the next 3 months.
Definitely. Yeah, that's something that we see all the time also with our own search business and whether operations or executive leadership or even really sales and marketing, which we do a lot of as well. That first 90 days is just so incredibly important, if you will. It's so critical to make an impression, not only in terms of your new boss, if you will, right, the folks that hired you on, but also with your peers and your subordinates, your staff. I mean, you're coming into an organization, not really being known at all to the rest of the group, and you have to make a good impression. So Edith, I'm kind of curious, just based on what you've seen out there, you obviously work with a lot of different executives over the years. What are some of the kind of the common areas, if you will, where people tend to kind of get tripped up in those first 90 to 100 days of a new position?
Great question. When we get hired, we are all excited about all the things that we are expected to get done. And depending on what our personality type is, we can fall prey to self-sabotaging ourselves in a number of ways. Some common traps that I see include a failure to focus, the desire to do too much. And so you end up digging 100 wells that are 10 foot deep instead of few wells that are really deep and that show results for you. So failure to focus is definitely one. A related one is saying yes too much, saying yes to everything, and because you're wanting to win people over, but if you say too early and too often, it can spread you so thin that people actually lose confidence and lose credibility. I see sometimes a failure to have that kind of clarity of what is it that we are doing process-wise, understanding the business well enough so that your recommendations feel like penny, they don't really resonate. So creating resonance that comes from having spent time understanding how the founders, especially if it's small business, see the business, where do they see it going? And even if your vision for it is different, creating that yes and approach so that they feel like you're a necessary partner, a useful partner. The person that they hired and why they hired you shines through in linking their vision with yours, because you may come in with all these great ideas, you think you've got the answer, how you're going to turn this business around or take them to the next level. If it goes too fast for the owner, for the founder, for the current CEO, even if they're second generation, it may not be to your advantage to go as quickly as you think you should be going. And that's a common failure I see from individuals who want to be perfect. We self-sabotage ourselves in a way that it's just want to do it perfectly, as if that's what's going to be the key to our success. And actually that has the opposite effect. It can slow us down. It can get in the way, frustrate people. And that is not a key success. I'll say a final one relates to trying to be too controlling. This is how it needs to be done, and requiring your team, your staff to adapt to your own style, because this is a proven method. You know it works, and if only they'll do it your way, everything will be great. So coming across as too controlling is definitely another way that I've seen people self-sabotage.
Gotcha. I think people obviously don't go into that situation thinking that they're self-sabotaging. They think they're doing what's prudent, what's efficient, and what's effective, not realizing that many of the things that you just talked about can end up, coming to fruition, if you will. And like you said, it has the opposite effect for sure. That can be very difficult. Do you kind of guide your clients and say, now here, do you kind of point out some potential pitfalls and say, hey, here's some things that I've seen people do that self-sabotage themselves unwittingly, unknowingly, and you point that out in the beginning, or do you kind of wait for things to unfold and then address it as it happens?
Yeah, a lot of our self-sabotage comes from overusing strength. So something that I'm good at and has been proven to work in my last role, not understanding that maybe that's not what is going to be the key to my success in the next one, is an important aha for people to think about early on during that transition phase. Actually, some tools that I encourage people to use, we can put it into the notes below as a link, an assessment that you can identify your top likely saboteurs, and whether that is the perfectionist or the controller or the person who just tries to do much. You can be aware. As you're self-aware, you can help to make sure that you work around that, you self-manage, because those things tend to be just an overuse of strength. So to be able to use it like a radio dial and know I need to dial it up to this point, and that's the optimal point. But if you're operating there too much, then it will get to be ineffective and actually counterproductive. Is really an important skill to develop, to have that self-awareness where you know whether you're operating from that strength or where you're overusing it is vital to self-awareness and to creating the connection with others.
So what are some of the key things that you really kind of focus on with your clients in that first 90 days for them to make that impact and really make a difference and build that credibility quickly?
Yes, when a person comes to me, it depends on where they are in their 90-day transition. If they're in a place where they've just accepted the role and they're transitioning out, the first thing that I say is plan your exit. Plan to disengage as quickly as you can. So often people work, because we're wonderful people who are giving and want to do the best for our current employer, to midnight on the last day and then start on a Monday. And that's not really setting yourself up for success. So what I say is, when you're even in the negotiation phase, begin to negotiate with the idea of having at least one, ideally 2 weeks in between. And I don't mean the 2 weeks of notice. You and I know, because I've been on the hiring side, I worked for a Fortune 500 company, and actually a couple of them, and companies of all sizes. And I know that when I hired, I would say, I found the perfect person. Can you start tomorrow? No, not tomorrow. You have to give 2 weeks notice. All right. You can give 2 weeks notice. But can you start immediately the Monday after?
Right.
And so we tend to come with that attitude toward our new hires. And at the same time, I would say, for those of you who are hiring managers, think of what's in it for your firm to allow that person to have a week at least in between to recharge, so that they start fresh and they're not needing to take a vacation because they're exhausted from their last job. And to give them time to really get to know your company in a way that they can hit the ground running. So the first thing I say is plan to disengage and plan that time in between so you are well rested. The second thing I say is create a plan for yourself. Understand that your first 90 days, you're still earning that trust, and it is vital to have people get to the point where they're saying to each other, we definitely hired the right person. And that doesn't come by accident. You don't just stumble into that. You need a strategy.
That's a really good point, definitely. And I think, your point is so well taken in terms of that time required in between. And the folks that you're coaching, the folks that I'm placing in jobs, they're all A players, right? They're all hard drivers, type A personalities as well. And the thought of them taking any time off, right, is just, oh my gosh, how can I possibly even think of that? Never mind asking for it. But I agree that refresh time, that break in between, especially, a lot of the folks that we work with, and I know you do as well, have been at their current job for a while. And they either haven't had a vacation or it's been minimal over the last several years, especially. But taking that time to really refresh, kind of take a step back and give your mind and your body, if you will, and your spirit a chance to get ready for the next endeavor goes a very, very long way.
One of the leaders that I began working with over the summer came to me and she said she had 2 weeks in between. So she'd given 2 weeks notice and she had negotiated as part of her starting date 2 weeks in between, one to take a family vacation, and then she used that second week to very specifically on her own time begin to know the company and begin to call her direct reports with the idea of, I'm just calling to introduce myself, to let you know a little bit about me, to get to know what's important about you, and for us to know each other as individuals before we hit the ground running, so that our first meeting isn't about the business, but it's about making that connection, because connection is important to me. And I will tell you now that she's 6 months into her role there. It has been fantastic. The relationships she's built, the things that she's been able to overcome that her predecessor had tensions within her organization previously, have been phenomenal. And I think a large part of that is her emphasis on creating those personal connections, both direct reports as well as with peers.
So let's talk a little bit, Edith, about kind of what you're seeing out there in terms of kind of that transition period and really, how companies or how executives are allowing their financial leaders or other leaders, operations or otherwise, giving them a little bit more leeway in terms of letting their plans play out and seeing kind of their new processes and new plans that come to fruition.
Yes, it certainly is a different time, isn't it? And what a surprise during COVID times is how quickly people have in fact been able to get hired and to make that transition, how quickly that we've adapted, and it hasn't been an interruption as I would have expected in the recruiting cycle. I am busier than ever in terms of people saying they have landed new jobs and they need to start, and what is the new strategy given how different the world is? How do I make connections with my colleagues, with my direct team in order to create the connection that I no longer have the opportunity to do one-on-one? So adapting, figuring that out is especially challenging for us introverts, and believe it or not, I count myself among those. And I hope that I actually am a story of hope for those of you who are introverts, because you can learn to take the initiative and to put yourself out there. I know that sounds cliche, in terms of reaching out to individuals and beginning to share. And why people come to me for coaching. How do I do that? How do I make these connections? Because otherwise we tend to have the conversations be a little bit transactional feeling, and that connection is missing. And so encourage people as part of their 30-day plan to identify some early wins project-wise. The early wins that's important is the relationship wins, which creates some sense of connection with individuals. And so particularly for those of us who tend to be more internally focused, let's use that as a strength in order to create a plan and to be strategic about who do I need to meet with. For those of you who are on the hiring side, I recommend that you be extra thoughtful in creating that plan for your new hire. All the more so, think of it as their hiring date or their start date is not the first date. You should begin your onboarding process a week or two before they actually begin, in terms of sending them the equipment that you need them, whether it's a computer or printers or whatever that you supply, as well as setting up time for those individuals that you think they should meet with, so that there is a scramble on day one. Okay, I'm here. What do you want me to do? Who do I meet with? And beginning to make the schedule to then. So the more thoughtful you can be as the hiring manager in setting that person up for success, the faster you'll have an RO on that new hire.
That's a really good point. That's a fantastic point. In fact, one of the things that we talk to our clients about also with recruiting that we do is that, yes, it's important for the new hire to make a good impression in the first 30, 60, 90 days. It's also just as imperative for the company to make a good impression on their new hire, their new employee, right? And to your point, I mean, simple things like getting the phone set up, getting the back pre-COVID when we were in office, having the actual physical space set up, getting the computer ready, business cards, whatever it might be, doing all that, on day one really makes for a very clunky, if you will, and not very productive first couple of weeks, especially. It's funny that you talk about, the introverted side. So a lot of the recruiting that we do is for sales and marketing leaders, and those folks, traditionally or stereotypically tend to be, pretty extroverted. But one of the challenges that comes into play there is that many of them get hired by founders or CEOs that maybe are more introverted, more technical in nature. Maybe they're an engineering background or operations background, if what have you. But it speaks volumes to the need to make sure that they kind of align themselves in terms of how they communicate with their new executive staff. And I would think that no matter kind of what the personality differences are, that'd be a big part of what you're talking about with your clients also is get a feel for that new communication style. Don't just assume that the way you communicated with your last employer is the way you're going to apply it this time around with the new employer, because it could be like night and day.
Exactly. And it's interesting you bring that up about communicating with individuals who have a different style from you, because I often hear that from leaders that I work with, that I'm having difficulty making that connection and drawing my new boss out. I want to have a deeper conversation. How do I do? And I feel like I'm hitting a stone wall. I'm not getting the kind of responsiveness that I would have expected and that I normally get from how people respond to me, they'll say. And so I point them to talking about values, drawing people out by figuring out or inviting them to talk about what's important to you. What are your values? How do you make decisions? Get them to talk about themselves, because all of us have something that we're excited about. Invite them to talk about their vision for the future, and open-ended questions, so that your meetings with them, your one-on-ones, are not about reporting out, but learning, accelerating the process of understanding how they think, so that you can incorporate that into your plans, the vision that you have for the unit that you were asked to lead, whether it's a salesperson or operations. And one of the other keys to success I'm finding is to have several conversations, several topics to cover, to negotiate stuff. Even if you think you understood very clearly what it is you were hired for and what your mandate is, there are always things that you didn't fully grasp the nuances of, because there wasn't time perhaps during the interview process. And so coming to clear understandings about your boss's expectations is one of the most important conversations to have early on in your first week. So let's go back to basics, boss. What are the most important priorities for you? And identifying some early wins and come to an understanding about what's important to them, so that you're working on that as your priority. And also the style discussion, as you brought up, Ken, understanding their style. And so I find that if they've ever done assessments like a Myers-Briggs type indicator can be helpful. If they've ever done a strengths finder or a Hogan assessment or an Enneagram or any one of these tools that are common, certainly in larger businesses, but sometimes even in founder-run businesses, that is a great starting point for making that connection. If they'll share their perspective, you quickly get, or their type, you quickly rapid insights, and then as you share yours, you make those breakthroughs. And I always say, you go first. If you want to create connections, especially with those who tend to be a little bit more introverted, you have to be the first one to ante up.
Right. Take that first step. Yeah, exactly. That's great. And what about kind of the, I guess, kind of a corollary to that, or a kind of an addendum to that is, you've got the different communication styles, certainly, but what about in terms of, kind of different, backgrounds and different experiences just based on generations, right? I mean, pre-COVID, and this is still true today, a little bit different because we're not in the same physical space, but certainly in terms of having a multi-generational workforce, that's not going to change anytime soon, right? And now even the Gen Zers, the kind of the late teens and early 20s, they're now also entering that workforce. How do you suggest they navigate that?
Great, great point that you're making, because we need to be adaptable. We need to be flexible, and to first have the context to understand that there is a difference in how you communicate with people of different levels. Not everyone understands that and thinks about that and has a strategy for it. So while I coach people, leaders, to ask their boss and adapt yourself to your boss, there's also value in you as a hiring manager, adapt yourself and being conscious and having that dialogue if your new hire doesn't bring it up, to say, I prefer to communicate by email. And so the younger person might well roll their eyes, but you know what? They'll respect and respond accordingly. Or I prefer to have voicemail because I can process and then I'll get back to you. If you are a younger person, you might similarly share what your preference is. Don't be concerned about interrupting me. I welcome text. I welcome Slack or whatever the communication method that your company might be using. Don't worry about picking up the telephone to ask me a quick question. Because some of us who perhaps are of an older school might have this idea of, well, I need to schedule a call. And that's one of the things that I coach people. The impromptu interactions are extra important during COVID times. And so whether it's a text to say, I'm thinking about you, or I saw this quote and it inspired me, I thought you find it interesting, or I saw this cartoon, or whatever it is, share something funny, a meme or whatever, just to create that kind of bond that you would otherwise have had around the cafeteria or in the hallways that you now need to create in a more thoughtful, deliberate kind of way, to have those spontaneous moments in a more strategic way. I know that's an oxymoron, but you've got to make it happen or it doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's that kind of planned spontaneity, right? Which you kind of have to orchestrate these days, because you can't just walk down the hall and open someone's door and chat with them on the spot. It's got to be orchestrated, because we're all in our work from home environments right now. What kind of conversations happening out there around how they have to change their leadership, their management style, right, to reflect what is happening right now? And it's probably going to be this way for kind of the foreseeable future. And for some companies, it's going to be the new norm. It's going to be the new permanent structure, work from home or work from anywhere. So I'm curious about how you're talking through that with your clients also, in terms of adjusting maybe their kind of legacy management style.
Yes, I remember the days that I was in corporate. I was responsible for a $900 million business with 250 facilities in 13 states. And the travel part was something I actually looked forward to, getting to spend time with my people, both in operations and finance. And so that bonding that came from being on an airplane with a colleague is irreplaceable. So we need to be thoughtful about how do we schedule time for this. We're so busy with the getting things done part as leaders that it takes extra effort to say, I need to reach out and invite the person for an impromptu meeting to understand what their priorities are, what is important to you, and creating that personal connection that you would otherwise have had on an airplane or at dinner after a client meeting. And one thing that I have recommended to my clients include set up these virtual lunches, virtual coffees, and really don't just invite the person to bring their coffee or bring their lunch, buy them lunch. I love that DoorDash, for example, has the ability to invite someone to order lunch and it's on you, and they can have it delivered at the same time. And it's kind of, more artificial way, but it creates a little sense of something that's happening. I invite people to share more about backgrounds, both literal and metaphorical. Yes, where I came from and so on, but give people a tour of your office. Often with my new clients, I will give them a tour of what full 360 view is of the office that I'm in right now, so people can appreciate the context that you're in. Perhaps give them a tour of your house, give them a sense of connection of who you are. Let them meet your kids, let them meet your dog or your cat. And it humanizes us and creates that warmth and gives people permission to be able to do that. It doesn't happen by itself. I remember years ago at DaVita, the person who is now the CEO, Javier Rodriguez, once was making a speech about something, and he was getting an award for fun, which was a core value at DaVita. And he was a great promoter of fun. And what surprised me about his acceptance speech is he said, fun doesn't just happen. You think that fun just happens in the moment, but it isn't. You've got to plan for it. You've got to allow for it. So it seems like an opposite. I think it sounds like an oxymoron, but same thing with fun, same thing with connection, not to plan for it. That is to say, plan to create the space and the time for it, to have meetings that don't have agendas. And that seems hard for people like me who come from a finance kind of background, and we think it's all about the doing. It's not. So much of your success in your first 90 days especially is dependent on your ability to connect and win people over so that they trust you, they know you, and that they feel comfortable sharing of themselves and telling you that they disagree with your idea, telling you that you might be making a mistake there. That thing you said at the meeting, I don't know if you noticed, that didn't land well. You rubbed the owner the wrong way. Are you aware? You might need to close the loop. You don't get that without having created the permissions and the trusting relationship. It's one of the things that I coach people to do differently now and more deliberately.
Great, that's great. No, I agree completely. I think that's one of the big conversations going to be, kind of in the ecosphere, if you will, of hiring and managing and leadership throughout 2021 and beyond. Also, let me ask you this kind of last question here, and this is a broad-based one, I realize, but one of the things that I have clients ask of me, both on the client hiring side, but also on the candidate side, is where should I spend my time, Ken? In the first 90 days. What's the most important aspect of me coming into this role and making an impact? Is it the people side? Is it the process side? Or is it just flat out trying to find ways to build revenue or build the brand in the case of sales and marketing? How do you respond to that if you get that question, where they should focus their efforts and really concentrate their time in those early 90 to 100 days?
Ken, it's balance. It isn't necessarily an either or. And if I had to prioritize, I would say start with the relationship. Having clear understandings with your boss. There's 5 conversations that are important to have. And for those of you who are interested, I recommend the book called First 90 Days, I think, by Michael Watkins. And so coach yourself into success. Read the principles of the book and set yourself up for what you need to do. And one of the things he talks about there is 5 conversations to have with your boss about negotiating your success, spending time with him. But the boss is just one element. And of course, your direct reports are a second. We often neglect the relationships with peers because your peers have the insights to help not step into something that you wish you hadn't. And creating the trusting relationship is one of the categories of early wins that I recommend to people. I thought what your early wins can be. I'd say a portfolio of 3 or 4 things so that at least 1 or 2 of them, or at least 2 of them should work through. I have enough, don't all have to be stellar, but that you can have something you can point to at the end of 90 days that says, this is I've been able to do to move the needle. So it's this dance between creating the relationships and understanding the business is equally important, because you may have great relationships, but if you haven't invested enough in understanding the processes, the products, the services of your company, then you may be making recommendations that are not going to play well, and you get the you're on the wrong path, to come back, you're off the reservation. And so that's one of those things that now you might have been embarrassed, you have to recover from. You can avoid that by, in parallel, understanding the business, spending time with customers, and building the relationship so that you are well informed in your recommendations. And as you float the ideas, you float them as trial balloons in open-ended ways to see what is getting traction. So people, relationship, process, products, learning business, so that you are well informed, because that will create credibility for you. And as you have credibility, you can win others over to support your initiatives. And you will want to have something specific to point to at the end of 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. And that comes by thinking through and asking your boss what's important to them. The early wins only matter if they're important to your boss.
Exactly, exactly. Well, and that's a great way also, I think, to your point, it's very well taken. That's a great way to make sure that that you can establish that alignment, right? And can establish that rapport. Is to say, boss, right? This is where I think we should focus our efforts based on our early conversations, the interviews, and what I see so far. But what are your alignment, or what are your expectations? Let's get in alignment and make sure that we're on the same page. Because the worst thing you can do is to go, direction A when your boss expects direction B, and then in 60 days, there's a complete misalignment in terms of what the expectations were, and nobody's happy. So I completely agree with that.
When I talk to people about the pillars of success in starting a new role, I think of it as having 4 pillars. And the first one is understanding the business and knowing what you're talking about, because you know the product lines, the service, what's important in terms of your company's strategy. And I encourage hiring managers to provide context to individuals even before they start. And if they have a couple of weeks in between, begin to send them information about your organizational chart. Who are the key players? Information that you would not have shared most likely in the interview process, but now you're ready to share strategic plans, any studies that have been done about your industry, things that will offer that context to accelerate the person's learning about your business, not just their role, but how that might impact other departments and peers. So the first pillar is that understanding of the business. The second pillar is creating the rapport with your peers, as well as with your boss and with those who report to you. Third, I would say, is creating that alignment. First with your boss, what is the vision? Clarify in greater detail than you may have gotten to during the interview process about what are the timelines, what are the resources that are available. It's one of the 5 conversations to have. So what are the resources that are available? And they may have a take on your department, an assessment. Oh, that's a pretty high functioning team you're inheriting there, Tom. Well, it may turn out that that's not the case. That perhaps, let's say, your accounts receivable department is doing really well. They're stellar and they have a deserved good reputation. You want to maintain success there. But you are noticing that the accounts payable department needs to be re-engineered, and you've got to move some people around. Then you may have some news for your boss to introduce here and reset expectations. We're not going to be able to go at quite the pace that I thought, because this hole exists. And by the way, you asked me to set up an acquisitions team. Well, it's going to go a little slower than we might have thought. Here's what I would need to accelerate that. I can still make the timeline if we can borrow some people from this or that department. So negotiating for resources, negotiating realistic expectations are a real key to your success. Because if you take everything as a given, you may end up going off in too many directions and not being able to get traction on any of them. So that's the second pillar. Third pillar. Fourth pillar is cultural acclimation and understanding who are the influencers and how is your company truly making decisions. When you go to a meeting, sit back and notice who speaks and who listens, who's got the influence. Are decisions made in meetings, or do they tend to be made behind the scenes with individual conversations, and meetings are more there about ratifying the situation? And I've noticed that, for example, in one leader that I'm working with, let's call him Vince. Vince joined a company from an organization that was very direct and very buttoned up. And he joined an organization that's much more consensus oriented. And he was initially quite frustrated that nothing seems to ever get done. And he was tempted to go off and just say, I'm going to, if we couldn't get a decision, I know what I need to do. Let me go make that happen. And he started to run into resistance, and happily he caught it early enough to be able to have us find different perspectives, different ways for him to fit in and to create that consensus and talk to people behind the scenes, understanding that's how it is. I'm not going to change it. I'm the one who needs to adapt. So understanding the cultural norms and the influencers, and creating the support network, so that in meetings you will have people who will say, yep, I talked to Vince about that. I know he's on the right path. My department's ready to do X, Y, Z, and support that is really key to building your reputation in the early days.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing those 4 pillars. I think that you've outlined them very succinctly and I think in a manner in which it really relates to any new hire, really any level, right? But also any function as well out there. You've got to have those all in place and understand, which ones are more of a priority, if you will, for your new boss. Whether your new boss is the CEO or the board or a private equity firm, or the head of sales or anything in between. So that goes a very long way. So Edith, this is really great information. I'm sure your clients get so much value out of working with you. How can prospective new clients, new individuals get a hold of you? Where can they find you?
The best place is through LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, both individually as well as through Next New Growth, with the name of the coaching company that I lead. And I think of myself as a connector of people, and I write blogs from time to time, including a series of blogs about the transition process. There's one about success in your first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 100 days, and others from time to time. And I'm also a curator of articles that are of interest to leaders. So Next New on LinkedIn is a great place to start.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you. And once again, I'm Ken Schmitt with TurningPoint Executive Search. You can find us also on LinkedIn and through our website, of course. One of the great things that Edith and I share is our love for sharing, creating good content, but also putting it out there for free and just getting people to see what we do and just learning from our experiences as well over the last couple of decades of our experience working with executives and professionals in a wide variety of companies too. So thank you all very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you for the next video installment next month as well. And feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, Ken.